Welcome to this episode of Unraveling Adoption, an intentional space to delve into adoption's complexities together. I'm Beth Syverson. I'm an adoptive mom of a 19-year-old son, Joey, who is struggling to find his own path. I am walking beside him while working on my own personal growth and healing. We are committed to helping anyone touched by adoption, and we want to help the general public understand adoption's complexities better too. This episode is sponsored by a friend of mine from my Taiko class, Barbara Ching, who surprised me with a donation. And Barbara is touched by adoption in the fact that her father was adopted in China. Thank you so much for your moral and financial support, Barbara. I really appreciate it. Today's guest is Tony Hynes, an African-American interracial domestic adoptee who was raised by white lesbian parents. He is the training specialist at CASE, which is the Center for Adoption Support and Education, where he designs innovative training curriculums to help adoptees by training their family members and professionals. He is completing his PhD in language, literacy, and culture, and his dissertation focuses on social connectedness among adult interracial adoptees. Tony has the lived experience as a transracial adoptee, plus he has an academic and scientific understanding of the problems that adoptees face. So Tony has been interviewed on several other excellent podcasts, including Lori Holden's Adoption, The Long View, Angela Tucker's The Adoptee Next Door, Simon Ben's Thriving Adoptees podcast, and also 3 Sides to Every Adoption, and several others. You should definitely check those out, and I will put links to those in the show notes. Those will give you a more comprehensive discussion of Tony's story. But for our Unraveling Adoption podcast today, we wanted to focus primarily on what it's like being an adoptee raised by gay parents. This one hits close to home for me since I'm a lesbian married to my wife, Jan, who has been Joey's stepmom since he was 5 years old. So thank you for bringing your story and your expertise to Unraveling Adoption, Tony. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Beth. Pleasure to be here.
I appreciate your willingness to talk about this part of your story, the LGBTQ plus part. I don't hear much about this topic in the adoption community in general. So let's raise it up and talk about it. So you were adopted in the mid-90s by your moms, Mary and Janet. And I was thinking mid-90s, okay, gay marriage wasn't even legal for another 20 years. That happened in 2013. So how were your parents able to adopt as a gay couple, or did they adopt just as a single person?
It's a great question. And yes, in the mid-90s, gay marriage wasn't legal. And it also wasn't legal for 2 women, 2 men, LGBTQ couples to adopt in this country either. And so what happened in my case was it was a single parent adoption. My mother, Mary, adopted me, and Janet was the legal guardian. So she didn't have all the same rights that Mary had at that particular time. And so that's how they did it, just to make it easier, because when 2 women were trying to adopt, normally it was a non-starter for adoption organizations at that particular time.
They just say, no, we don't let gay people adopt. But if you went in as a single person, like, did Mary bring Janet to the meetings or just leave her home? Did they pretend like she was literally single, or did they kind of try to hide it? Do you know?
I think that they didn't hide it, but at the same time, they also didn't act as though both parents were the ones adopting, if that makes sense. So to your question, Mary would be the one going to the meetings, filling out the paperwork. But with our lawyers, they weren't trying to tell anyone that it was only one person adopting. So I think there are multiple parties involved, just knowing that 2 women were going to be raising this child, but only one of the women was going to be filing for the adoption because
legally adopted.
It was going to be exactly.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Were they domestic partners at the time, or was that even legal at that time? I can't remember.
So they were not domestic partners at that time, no.
Okay. I can't remember. I know I did that before we got married, when we couldn't get married yet, but it's so complicated. And we just are all trying to navigate this and trying to, get on equal footing. And we have to kind of do these dances, right? Just kind of work around the system. And I know that a lot of adoption agencies are Christian, and many Christian organizations are very biased against LGBTQ people. Not all, but I bet that maybe Mary had to find an adoption agency that was a bit more open in that way.
Well, in my case, it was a bit different because I was adopted from the foster care system. And so it wasn't through a private agency. So I started out as a child that was fostered first. And then after that point in time, Mary and Janet decided that they wanted to follow through with an adoption of me.
Okay.
And so because it went through the foster care system, there wasn't the same type of that red tape or anti-LGBTQ red tape.
Gotcha.
As there may have been with a religious organization that was also an adoption organization.
I see. And how long did they foster you?
So first they fostered me when I was about 3 years old. And then the adoption happened when I was about 5 years old. So it was about 1.5 to 2 years before I was adopted.
Okay. And when you were little, I mean, what do you remember? Do you remember feeling like, not only am I Black with a white family, but I also have 2 moms. I mean, how aware were you that your family looked different in a couple ways?
Oh, right away. Right away, I shouldn't say right away because I don't have a memory of right away, I guess. I don't have a memory of when I was 2 or 3 years old necessarily. But I do remember when I was 5 and 6 years old, and I remember going out to get pizza with my moms. I remember going to the park, and I just remember the stares that we got when our family went out. And those were the times that I noticed, hey, my family is something different about us. We aren't like the other families that are sitting next to us in this booth at this pizza place. We are a 2-parent household, like many other families that are here, but we aren't a 2-parent household where the parents are the same color as the children.
Yeah.
We aren't a 2-parent household where the parents are different genders from one another either. And that seems to be not only different, but intriguing to people because they're staring at us, they're looking at us. So I noticed right away. Yeah. But there was also, of course, for me, this backdrop happening at the time where, yes, I was adopted when I was 5, but then the adoption was overturned by a panel of judges who had decided that a white same-sex-headed household wasn't the right household for a Black child to exist in. And so I came home one day from a class field trip, and my mother, Janet, was crying on the couch, and I didn't know what was going on. And then they told me that the adoption had been overturned, that I was no longer technically adopted anymore. And so I didn't understand that. But I very quickly began to understand that it was overturned because people didn't like the fact that we were different from other families that were adopting. And that was something, again, that factored into, well, okay, people are staring at us because they're intrigued, but is there kind of, for some people, maybe a more nefarious reason why they're staring at us? Maybe they don't want us to be a family. And so I was aware of that at a pretty young age.
Yeah, this part of your story is so sad and frustrating because you think, okay, you adopt, and I don't know, maybe sometimes there's a waiting period or whatever, but you were adopted out of foster care. So I don't know, how did that happen? Did someone complain? Did your birth family try to fight for you? Is that what happened, that the case got back into court?
Yeah, so it was that. We found out that my birth family, specifically my step-great aunt, who at the time was claiming to be my grandparent because that was something that would gain her easier custody of me. She had cared for some of the children in her family that for different reasons weren't able to be raised by their parents. And so she had taken in several different children, and she thought that Tony was probably going to be another one of those children that she was going to raise. My birth mother happens to be schizophrenic, and so she gave me to my grandmother to raise me for the first year or so of my life, and also was raising me herself, but eventually understood that she wasn't going to be able to fulfill the duties that she wanted to. And so that's when she placed me in foster care. And after a certain point in time, that's when Mary and Janet came into the picture. But I think that the thought process that they had was, Tony's going to be in foster care for a while, and then we're going to get him out of foster care and he's going to be raised in the family. And that's just what's going to happen. And so when they found out I was going to be adopted, I think that in and of itself was shocking. But then there were 2 other layers to it. It was, okay, I'm going to be adopted. A white family is going to be adopting me, and a lesbian couple is going to be adopting me. And then there was another element of their lawyers and our social worker were actually working against my family, meaning Mary, Janet, and I, They were feeding misinformation to my grandmother and the family and telling them that, well, if you allow this adoption to go through, then he won't know what it means to be a man or a Black man in this world. And you can't have this happen because this is going to be an atrocity. So you need to fight this. You need to fight this. And so, yes, it was them who had, thoughts of bias around what my type of family structure, our family structure was going to look like. But they were also aided in that bias by a system, by individuals working within the system who also had bias as well, that led to challenge and eventually the overturning by judges who also had bias in this case too. So you had different actors really interacting with one another to overturn that initial decision for me to be adopted.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of factors were going against you. And even you said your own social worker that was supposed to be on your side.
Yeah.
Do you think it was like, can you parse out the percentage that was about race and the percentage that was about homophobia?
It's a great question. And I haven't been able to do that. I've been thinking about that for my entire adult life, honestly. And I think that the two are inextricably linked with one another. I think that my birth family didn't want to see me raised in a white household because of the history attached to Black children being raised in white households. I also, though, think that there was a big piece of it that had to do with them being uncomfortable, them having bias, and being judgmental about LGBTQ people in general. Yeah. And they had their own assumptions about who LGBTQ people were. They thought, I'm sure, that they were sinners because my grandmother's she was a very religious woman. Oh, yeah. And so this was a type of sin to her that was worse than other sins. And she didn't want to see me raised in an environment of sin. And I think that's what her thinking was. And also the race piece factored into it as well. And so I think that both of those things were happening at once. And unfortunately, I think people assume that in 2023 that those things are no longer the case for both of those instances, but they are. They are. And my grandmother over time came to be, I think, more accepting of my family. But it took a really long time. It took a very long time for her to even get to that place and for some other people in the family to even get to that place.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we're certainly not done at all. All you have to do is look around at all the trans laws that are getting put in place and the extreme hatred and threats against trans people. It's really horrible. We're definitely not done. I don't know what it was like where you grew up, but my wife and I are in LA and I work in Orange County, and we literally do not feel comfortable holding hands or having public displays of affection in any way in public, unless we're at like a Pride festival or something, or at our church, which is kind of ironic. But we go to a Unitarian Universalist church, which is super cool about LGBTQ people. And we're married. We've been married for 10 years now. It's our 10th anniversary coming up. But criminy, it is not done. We are not done, people. We are not done with this fight for LGBTQ equality and just dignity, humanity. It's really actually ramping up lately, I think, especially for trans people. So, So when you were in elementary school, let's say, and you were kind of aware of your parents looking different. Also, by the way, I think I remember your parents were quite different in age.
Yes, because they were 20 years separate in age.
So I bet people could not figure out, okay, is this a mother-daughter with their child? Are they friends? Are they? I bet people were just scratching their head. Oh my gosh. But did you get bullied as a kid? Did other kids bully you in elementary school or in high school or?
So yes and no. So I would say that in middle school, I did get bullied a bit, but not around my family background at all. It was more about being a new kid in school and that kind of typified bullying experience that, millions in this country have experienced. I was fortunate that when I was in elementary school, I went to a Quaker school, and the Quakers are very accepting, very non-violent, and we are going to practice what we preach, and everybody's going to be treated the way that you would like yourself to be treated. And so everyone in school, the Quaker school I went to, was very small. only about 125 to 150 kids.
Mm-hmm.
So everyone knew who your family was. Everyone knew who my family was. And I got some curious questions like, who is that woman and who is that other woman?
Mm-hmm.
But no one ever said to me, you and your family are bad and you should feel this way or you should feel that way about having two moms or about having white parents and you're a Black child. And so I didn't experience bullying from my community from that standpoint. The bullying, I would say just negative comments that I got when I was younger, those were received more when I was interacting with members of my grandmother's, my step great aunt's family, and specifically her herself. And she was a woman who did not hold her tongue or hold her thoughts. And some of those thoughts were prejudiced thoughts, quite frankly. And so those were some thoughts that I would hear when I went to her house. But as far as the negative things that were said about my family, I received more of those things actually as an adult or as a teenager in college, for example. Mm-hmm. So it was really when I was going into friendships that were these deeper friendships sometimes that I was starting to experience people finding out, oh, well, I haven't seen your family. Now you're telling me about your family. Now I have more questions about this. And some of the questions I have are leading questions, or some of the statements that I have are statements that are problematic or prejudiced statements.
Can you give us an example of what you experienced?
Yes. So I had a disagreement with a friend when I was in college. And after this disagreement, I went to him and I thought it was going to be an instance where, I apologize and then you apologize and then we just move on with that in mind. So I apologized. And then he said back to me, well, yeah, basically, I accept your apology, but I don't think we should be friends anymore. The way that you were raised was just different than the way that I was raised. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, we were just raised differently. And I said, well, if you're referring to my moms, they raised me very well. And I'm, very proud of them. And he didn't really say anything. He didn't confirm or deny that that's what he meant. But to me, in knowing him and knowing his particular faith background and how he felt about certain things, that's what I took his statement to mean. And I remember telling another mutual kind of friend of ours who I wasn't quite as close with, but who was a mutual friend of ours about the situation. And he was just like, well, why don't you, before I told him the whole thing, why don't you just become, cool with it? I'm sure if you apologize, he apologizes, you guys will be fine. And I said, well, I already apologized. And this is what he said to me. And this mutual friend's response was to say, well, I'm just learning that you have gay parents for the first time now. And I understand why he feels that way now. I mean, it's a sin. Being gay is a sin. And he said, look in the Bible. And he literally we were in his dorm room. He literally pulled out a Bible. He says, look, and he pulls out one of the famous passages and he reads the passage. He said, it's a sin. And then I forget when I had shared it, but I had shared that one of my moms had died. One of my adopted moms had died. And he said that it's just a fact, she's in hell. That's,
oh my gosh,
that's just what it is.
Oh, that's horrible.
And so that was the first time where I was like, my bubble was kind of bursted. And I realized, hey, people really aren't accepting of my family in the ways that maybe I thought that they were before. And it forced me to adjust and to adapt and also to be more intentional about the friendships that I was making and more intentional about telling people about my family.
Yeah. Your story and stories like that, what you just said, remind me that it's more than just LGBTQ people that are dealing with this. You guys that are the children of gay people inevitably will come across this. And I mean, I've been told by family members that I'm going to hell, and that does not feel good. But to get that secondhand, like you had nothing to do with any of this, and just how painful that must be from your perspective. Because you didn't choose this. You didn't choose any of this. And you're now in a space where you've got to decide, am I willing to be friends with these people? Am I willing to date this person if they're going to be anti-gay? Or am I willing to align myself with this or that community or religious organization or whatever? I understand the extra layers that adds to kids of gay parents. It's sad. But yeah, it definitely affects you, huh?
Yeah, it does. And The answer to that question is, I don't want to be friends with people who are anti-gay.
Mm-hmm.
For the same reason, no one should want to be friends with someone who's racist.
Yeah.
Why would I want to be friends with someone who's openly or who
Yeah.
is racist, period, right?
Yeah.
Why would I want to be friends with someone who's anti-gay? I would hope that people who don't have gay parents would feel that way too, right?
Yes.
That this would just be, this is something that just isn't fine as far as me wanting to be friends with you. This is a non-starter.
Yep.
And I wish that it didn't take kids like me or adults like me now who've had LGBTQ plus parents and feel strongly in that way. I wish that everyone felt as strongly about not wanting to be friends with people who feel that way, because then hopefully those people who feel that way, then maybe they would begin to think a little bit deeper about, well, why do I feel this way?
Yeah.
Why do I really feel this way? Because, I'm friends with the thief, and I'm friends with the liar, and I'm friends with maybe the adulterer, but I can't seem to want to be friends with people who are gay. Why is that? And so it would force deeper conversations than we're having right now. And I don't want to be in community with people who would express those thoughts, of course, about my parents. It doesn't mean that I shy away from engaging in uncomfortable dialogue with people with differing viewpoints than mine. But if you're going to be in my inner circle, then
definitely.
It's important that you respect my family, myself, and having prejudice towards my family, having prejudice towards gay people in general is not something that I think is respectful. And so I would shy away from wanting to be in community with those types of thoughts.
Yeah, I totally agree. And gay people for millennia have figured out how to create their own families and, figure out who their people are. It may not be who you grew up with or who you're related to by blood. It's very tricky. And the whole sin thing just kind of makes me a little bananas, oh, it's a sin, but we love you anyway. I get that sometimes. Other things are sins, but Jesus still loves you or whatever. Like, well, I don't think it's a sin. I don't think it's a sin who I love. I think that comparing me to a thief or a prostitute, it's just so derogatory. It's like, come on, you guys. All it is we just love somebody else that is not as typical as most people. How can that be a sin? I just don't get it.
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree. I don't think being gay is a sin either.
Yeah.
And I also hate the sin, love the sinner conversation that goes on with LGBTQ plus individuals within family situations, because that's also something that it's extremely alienating. And it also tells someone that who they are is wrong. Like who you are is inherently wrong. Who you are is an inherent bad on society, which is not the case. And it's really hard to shake people's thoughts on that, because usually if someone thinks that way, they're really, really entrenched in that belief. And so, again, it drives me to, create our own people that we are interacting with, defining our people, defining family and community that we are comfortable with. And so I think that that's what I found as I grew into adulthood, is that I wanted to be around people who understood that this was my stance, one, and that two, that if we're going to be really good friends, then it's unlikely that you're going to be able to, be friends with me on a deep level and think being gay is a sin, to be quite frank with you.
Yeah. There's that thing about, let's just agree to disagree. But it was James Baldwin that said, not if it has to do with who I am as a person. I don't know. You might know that quote better than me, but I don't agree to disagree about this one. Sorry. It's too much.
No, it's a great quote, and I don't have it handy, but he talked about humanity. Yeah. It disrespects my humanity to say, let's agree to disagree about the legitimacy of my humanity. And so it's not okay to just agree to disagree and move on when it comes to topics like that. We need to agree about where you stand and where I stand, so we know where each other stands. But we can't say that we're just going to be dismissive of this type of conversation, because that's what leads to violence, all forms of violence that we see happening to gay people. Because when you say that something is a sin, it gives license to people that want to cause harm to the individuals they think are committing sin to do that. And then it also gives reason for people to say, well, yeah, it was bad that that trans woman was attacked. You know, it was bad that trans man was attacked, but they shouldn't have been out dressing that way. They shouldn't have been doing, and it becomes victim blaming, right? And it becomes another instance where we're not protecting marginalized individuals in our society because of our own biased sets of beliefs about the legitimacy of their very existence and personhood, which is something that I feel very strongly about. Sometimes people ask me, I've gotten the question, you probably wouldn't feel that way if you weren't raised by gay people. And I just say, that's an impossible question to answer. That's like me saying, and because it happened in that situation, the person who said my moms were going to hell, and I responded, he responded back, and eventually it got to the point where he said that, you wouldn't feel this way if you weren't raised by gay people. And I said, well, you wouldn't feel this way if you weren't raised how you were raised. Yeah. And he said, no, I would definitely still feel this way. And I was like, well, that doesn't make sense. That then the contradiction that you're making there, right? And so I think that we are where we are when it comes to, like you said, we can't choose who's going to raise us, but I'm very proud of who raised me. I'm very proud of my family, and I'm willing to fight for my family. I'm willing to stand up for my family. And I think that, yes, to your point there, and I've talked to other kids raised by LGBTQ plus individuals or couples, for us, even those of us who don't identify as LGBTQ plus ourselves, there is a sense of having to come out sometimes to people because we risk people saying things like that to us when we tell them about our families, or we risk finding out about, well, maybe they think being gay is a sin. And so I really liked you before as far as this dating thing was going, but now that I found that out about you, I can't continue in this. We've gone on a couple of dates and I can't continue with this, right? So we have to say to ourselves, when do we feel comfortable, quote, coming out about our families? And when do we feel comfortable sharing and not sharing? And what does that look like for us in practice? And so those are decisions that we have to make all the time. I have to make those decisions sometimes. I honestly have to make those decisions even in the trainings that I do, because I often do trainings where I'm speaking to a group of folks who are learning about interracial adoption or learning about birth family connection. So I introduce myself as Tony Hynes. I'm a training specialist. I'm an adoptee. I'm an interracial adoptee. And then I sometimes stop. And sometimes I have added that I was raised by LGBTQ parents. And then sometimes I stop and I don't add that, because I know in my head, if I'm training, especially in a certain state or these states, not to generalize, but that some people in that audience, even in whatever state I'm training in, that they might gain assumptions about me and be less tuned into what I'm about to say, even though what I'm about to say is going to still touch upon my family background and having LGBTQ parents. But I know that if I put that in the tagline, that those assumptions may stop them in their tracks from wanting to listen to me.
Yeah, they'll turn you off completely and not be able to listen. Yeah, that's really unfortunate. And the LGBTQ piece, you can hide more than your race. I mean, your race is pretty evident when you walk in front of a group, right? I guess maybe not that you were interracially adopted, that you could let people know, but you could, for quite a while, keep the LGBTQ piece out of it. I mean, all of us can. How many gay people have hid in the closet for their whole life? We have a friend that was in his 80s when he finally came out, but it's so not fair that you have to do that. It's sad. And my son, I thought that he was born in 2003. So I thought his generation would be much better at it than my generation, for instance. But no, it's really terrible, because guess who's raising those kids? My generation. And they are still influencing these kids, especially the racist high school that he went to in Huntington Beach was also very homophobic. And I didn't realize the amount of bullying he was getting for having gay parents. And we were out at his baseball games. We didn't hide who we were. We just were his parents. And I feel bad that he had to pay the price for that. And I wouldn't undo it or anything. Like I wouldn't not be gay for it, but it just sucks that it's just an extra layer of garbage that he had to deal with on top of everything else. Being a transracial adoptee from Japan, I'm white, he's Asian, and just being an adoptee in general, and just like so many things, so many intersections. So, what advice do you have for adoptive parents that are LGBTQ that are raising adopted kids? What did your parents do well, and what could they have done differently, if anything?
Well, one thing they did well was sending me to a Quaker school because I didn't have that experience. It wasn't like I didn't have that experience in the way that like I was shielded. It was a bubble. It was more that I was taught to treat people the way that you want to be treated and to have that particular value system, which is something that really formed who I was going to become in the future. So placing your child in environments like that, where that's what kids are being taught to do, is really important, where that's emphasized not only at home, but the teachers are emphasizing that in their classrooms, because we got that all the time in the school that I went to. So that's one thing. As far as the things in general that I wish they had done more of, or that I would like to see other parents doing, is when I talk to parents about interracial adoption, I talk about the importance of racial mirrors and representation, having books, having movies, going to cultural events, doing those things, talking about racism. Those are all things that I mention as really, really important things to do, and especially talking about racism. And so the same thing is true of advice that I give to LGBTQ adopted households. It's really important to talk about homophobia. It's really important to talk about Stonewall. Right? It's really important to talk about civil rights for gay people and how we got to this point where your two moms and your two dads are able to marry. Why it was so difficult to get to that point in the first place was because people were against it because they were against gay people in general in this country. And that many people still hold those values. There are people out there that are working still to this day to try to upend same-sex marriage, to try to upend Obergefell v. Hodges. And so that's something that exists. And so it allows them, if they have that information, then to go out into the world armed with that information to know that they may receive some of that societal backlash that their parents have been receiving, that gay people, that LGBTQIA plus individuals have been receiving and currently receive in this country and society in general. And that allows them then to have you to say, hey, this is what I experienced at school today. Remember what we talked about? Well, I think some of the students have been negatively influenced by some of these thought processes in the past. And what happens when parents don't talk about how gay people have been discriminated against, marginalized, mistreated, and a child hears those negative connotations said to them, is they internalize those things. And sometimes they think, well, maybe there is something wrong with gay people, or maybe there is something wrong with me if I'm identifying as LGBTQ plus myself. Maybe having gay parents did, quote, make me gay, right? That a ridiculous thought in nature. If they have that information, it's less likely that they're going to feel that way, and more likely that they're going to feel a greater sense of well-being about themselves. And I would also recommend, if you do have, organic friendships with other individuals who identify as LGBTQ plus, that the kids see that. The kids see the gay man coming to dinner, the other lesbian double dating, the other lesbian couple in the neighborhood, right? That's important for kids to see and to have that normalized for them at a young age. So they have that representation, and they have even more of a feeling of, no, like, it's not just my moms who are good people. Yeah. I know Gary over here, and I know Sheila over here. And we're not only just like you, because sometimes I hear that we're just like your families. It's not about being just like your families. It's about being a good person in general, and about not categorizing individuals as anything more or less because of who they love and who they are. And that's something that kids should be hearing as well at young ages, and it should be continued to be preached to them. And then the last thing is being intentional about talking to them about the friendships that they are going to be making. telling them that, yes, it's going to be difficult when you reach those teenage years. People are saying all types of homophobic things at school. How would you like to respond to some of the things that are said? If a classmate says that's gay or pause to you, how do you feel? How does that make you feel? How would you like to respond to that? Mm-hmm. And would you want to be friends with that person? Because we understand how it is and how you might still want to be friends with that person in high school, because all the boys, because a lot of times it's boys talking this way, all the boys are talking this way. Do you still want to be friends with them? And giving them permission to say, I kind of do. Okay, if you do, then what would you like to say to them? Because you're in community, you're in friendship with them. What would you like to say to them in response to some of those things, those negative comments that they continue to make? And walking them through and helping them really communicate effectively that, hey, I'm not really cool with you saying that's gay, and this is the reason why, right? If you have a problem with that, it is what it is. We can be friends or we cannot be friends, but I don't want you to say it like this. This is why I have an issue with it. And I've actually heard from some parents recently that they're hearing homophobic comments sometimes said to them by their children who are interacting with kids at school who are saying homophobic things. And then they're going home and they're using homophobic language in the household.
Oh, that doesn't feel good.
For parents, right? For parents, that has to feel terrible. Yeah. And so setting those boundaries is really important too.
It sounds like maybe your parents did that with you, or is this what you've learned more as a professional?
I think both are true. I wouldn't say that my moms were intentional about those things. They weren't intentional about talking to me about Stonewall. But I do remember my mother, Mary, she was going to seminary at the time. And she came home one day and she was working on a presentation. And she was a very religious woman. The presentation was back in the days where projectors were what you did presentations on. And so on the left side of the projector screen was Jesus Christ, and Jesus Christ strewn out on the cross. Okay. And then on the right side of the projector screen was Matthew Shepard strewn out, his arms and legs nailed to a fence in Wyoming. And so I knew about Matthew Shepard when I was 8 years old. Yeah. So that was something that I had knowledge of. She wasn't intentional in saying, Tony, this is the way the world may treat gay people. She was showing me this is the way the world has treated Matthew Shepard because he's gay. And so that sent a message to me that people were out there that were going to hate our family and maybe even going to try to harm our family simply because of what we looked like. Yeah. And so I think that having some of those things out there in the open and not shielding, just like we don't want to shield kids from talking about, racism, we also don't want to shield them from talking about the fact that Black trans women are murdered at, exponential rates, for example, compared to the rest of the population. Yeah.
And isn't the suicide attempt rate for trans people like 10 times non-trans people? Yeah. It's really, really brutal there especially for trans people. Well, so it sounds like the modern way of doing things for parents is in all these areas is to be very open and intentional, maybe even role playing or predicting what might happen and talking it through and kind of just rolling with things and not just kind of waiting for stuff to happen. Does that sound right?
Exactly. Because these things, unfortunately, a lot of times are going to happen. Yeah. If you haven't done that preparation, if you haven't done that role playing, if you haven't educated your children, what's going to happen is they are going to feel like they can't go to you because, well, why would I go to someone who hasn't been comfortable talking to me about this before? So I'm just going to go to myself or go to peers and handle this by myself. And you don't want that as a parent, right? You want your kids to feel comfortable talking to you about all of the things in their life that are difficult and challenging for them. And this is one of them. I was interacting with a gay dad from New York City last year, and he was asking me questions about my upbringing, and I was telling him about, this was the 90s and this is what was going on. And he said, well, I'm so glad, like my kid, we live in New York City, goes to this school, and we don't have some of that stuff going on. And I said, I'm not sure that that's the case. We probably do still have this stuff going on, no matter what city in this country you live in. There is prejudice towards gay people. I don't care if you live in the most liberal city in this country. And what's also going to happen is your child isn't going to exist in the same space for every single month or year or time. Yeah. So what happens when they go to another place that's different? Or what happens when they get older? You know, how are they going to interact with these things then? Things are going to look different for them when they're 29 versus when they're 9 years old. And so it's important when they are 9 to have some of these difficult conversations with them in age appropriate ways.
I totally agree with you. And I am guilty of just thinking, oh, it's all good now. I was very naive about that. And I thought, okay, he's going to be all right. And he didn't talk to me about it, which is because he knew it was kind of an uncomfortable topic. So he just stuffed it. He didn't tell me about all the bullying until he was hospitalized with his mental health crisis, and then I found out, oh my God, he's been carrying all this around. So we want our kids coming to us, and it involves us proactively bringing these topics up. It's not super fun and it's uncomfortable, but I totally agree with you. I think it's really important. I want to find out, are you still in touch with your birth family, and how is that going?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. So I am in touch with members of my birth family, and my story is complicated. And by that, I mean that even describing them as my birth family is something that I have to give a caveat for, because technically the people that I'm describing as my birth family aren't actually my birth family a lot of times, because they're the family of the person I described as my grandmother, who's really my step-great aunt. Okay. But I didn't know that she was my step-great aunt, that she wasn't my birth grandmother till I was 19, 20 years old. Oh, wow. And so I grew up thinking that this was my birth family that I was going to see, because that was the stipulation in the custody agreement, that I would go to see them every other week. Okay. So when I talk about my birth family, I'm talking about my birth sister, but I'm also mentioning members of my grandmother's family, because that's how I think of them. But I've been in contact on and off with my birth sister throughout my adult years. And, we have a complex relationship, like many adoptees and birth siblings do. But I have been in contact with her on and off throughout adulthood. And I have also been in contact on and off as well with members of my grandmother's family throughout my adult life. And these things are complicated. I wish I had a kind of answer that was a ribbon bow. This is kind of settled, but I don't, because adoption is a lifelong journey. Relationships are constantly evolving. There's ebb and flow to them. And I'm one of the individuals when it comes to birth family who exists in that kind of realm of ebb and flow. And I also found out that I have another birth sister out there who is the product of a closed adoption as well.
Oh, no kidding.
Exactly. I haven't had contact with her before. I hope to eventually have that with her too. So these are complex things that require a lot of time to process and navigation. And I think open discussion about too, because a lot of people are going through things like this.
Yeah. Well, your story is very complex. It has so many different levels and layers to it. And I should mention your wonderful book, The Son with Two Moms. And it really outlines your whole story, and it's very well done. And I can just feel the love you have and the respect you have for your adoptive moms. And despite all the struggles that you guys had just to basically exist as a family unit, your love for them just really shines through. So it's beautiful. And I know your one mother passed away, sadly, when you were a teen, right?
I was 12.
12. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Are you still in touch with your other adoptive mom?
Yeah, so we talk every day.
Aw.
So yeah, I'm in contact.
Do you guys go to pride festivals and stuff together, or do activist stuff together? Or?
No, we don't. I get that question a lot. And my mom is an introvert, and so she is not really the crowd type in general. Yeah. But when I was growing up, we didn't go to Pride, I don't think. But she's always somebody that has been, again, really in support of rights for different populations. And that's something that was great. My moms were not perfect in terms of they made the same mistakes that a lot of adoptive parents make, mistakes that lead me in my trainings to help adoptive parents, hopefully to not make those mistakes, or if they do, to know how to confront those things and also help their children, support their children, and also support themselves in knowing that they're not going to be perfect. And I think when I started telling my story, I told it in a way in which my moms were kind of propped up as like a shining example of what to do. And in a lot of ways they were, but in some ways they weren't as well. And that's okay. It's okay to have that duality. I think I also felt pressure because I have an LGBTQ adoptive family, because my two moms are lesbian moms, that they need to be perfect. They need to be great, because if they're not, then people are going to attack my family and say, see, this is why this family type shouldn't exist. Because even with the quote gay ones, even with the ones who are supposed to be quote woke, they're still doing these things. They're still having microaggressions, right? They're still doing things in relation to birth family stuff that maybe is not the best approach to certain things. And so they shouldn't have kids, or they should be criticized. And so I think I felt some pressure then to maybe talk about them in ways that highlighted the things that they did well, because they did a lot of things very well. So I would say for other adult children out there who are kids of LGBTQ plus parents, know that you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be straight, because some of us also feel pressure to be straight and cisgender, because the same thing, if we're not, they're going to say, look, you don't have to prop up your parents as, shining examples, because humanity is all about existing in the margins of good and complex and challenging. And that was definitely the case in my family structure as well.
Yeah, it's a whole lot of gray. I never thought about that. Like, if you're an adopted kid of an LGBTQ plus family, because the scare out in the culture is that, they'll make you gay. But what if you really are gay? And then you're like, oh man, I don't want to be like the one that shows that people make people gay. And like, oh man, that's complex. But everyone should just be who they are, period. Just let everybody be who they are. Come on.
I completely agree. I've had some adoptees who have gay parents that have literally told me, I thought to myself, if I'm gay, I'm just not going to tell anyone. And I'm just going to die with people thinking that I'm straight, because I don't want to do that to my parents and my family. And so it's another pressure that kids have. And I think that parents sometimes, I've had gay parents say that they don't want their kids to be gay just because they know all of the challenges that they went through. And so if they're not having those conversations, like, it's okay for you to be gay, son. It's okay for you to identify as trans. If they're not hearing things like that, if the kids aren't hearing things, then they're getting a lot of times another message that society doesn't want me to be gay, and I don't want to let my parents down by identifying as LGBTQ plus either.
I never thought about that angle. Oof, that's tough. Are there any resources for LGBTQ plus adoptive parents or parents of an LGBTQ plus adoptee?
Yes, so I definitely recommend Rainbow Families, which is a national DC headquartered organization where LGBTQ plus adoptive families often meet. I also recommend Family Equality, which is an organization that I'm a part of on the board. We do a lot of work around activism for LGBTQ plus families, but we also have Family Week, where LGBTQ plus adoptive families meet.
Nice.
And I would also recommend Collage as well as an organization. Collage is an organization that is founded by the adult children of LGBTQ plus parents, and they have a lot of programming and monthly support groups for LGBTQ plus adoptive families. And I'd also recommend CASE and the Center for Adoption Support and Education. We also have some programming now for LGBTQ plus families, and I do some trainings on the topic of LGBTQ plus adoption as well. So those are just a few of the resources. PFLAG is another good one. And I'd also just recommend that people just Google resources. Sometimes that's the best way, but the organizations that I mentioned are really, really great. And I definitely recommend them.
I will put those all in the show notes, which you can find if you scroll down underneath the audio feed. You can find all the show notes, or if you're on a phone, sometimes you have to slide it over to the left and it's on a different page on your phone. So go find all these notes. These are really great resources. I've never heard of some of these either. So I'm really glad that you shared those. I will make sure all of the adoptive parents in my group know about them. Is there anything else that you would like to say, or would you like to let people know how to get a hold of you?
Yeah, so people can get a hold of me by emailing me if you want. You can email me at hynes@adoptionsupport.org. You can also check out the book that I wrote, The Son with Two Moms. It's on Amazon. I also wrote Why We Shouldn't Call Adoptees Lucky, which appeared in Catapult, which you can check out as well. And please go to the Center for Adoption Support and Education's website for information on other trainings that I do, but also we have a lot of great resources there just about adoption in general.
Yeah.
And in relation to what I would like to say to kind of close things out, I again would reiterate that we are at a time in this country where over 400 bills that are anti-gay, anti-trans bills have been passed now, and we're only in the month of April. We've already surpassed the total number of anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ plus bills in general from all of 2022, which was another record year.
Oh my God.
So we are not at a place where people are accepting in the ways that they should be of our bodies, of our families. And so to protect ourselves, it's important that we arm ourselves with information about what's going on politically. This isn't a time really to bury our heads in the sand about what's going on politically. And it's also a time to wrap our arms around the ones that we love. And one of the greatest political acts that we can do is simply loving each other. And so to continue loving each other throughout all of this is really integral and important. And for me, again, I am proud of my parents and my family, but I'm also really glad that I've been able to address the complexity of my family at the same time, and the fact that we did the best that we could, but that we weren't perfect, and that your families won't be perfect, nor they should be. But it's really important with adoption that we're addressing separation, grief, and loss. And because so many LGBTQ plus families are adopting across race, it's important that we're addressing the intersections of race and sexual identity in our households, and doing that in really intentional ways for the betterment of our children. And like I mentioned, talking about racism is important. Talking about homophobia is really important. And surrounding ourselves with a community where we're practicing to treat others how we would like to be treated is also really impactful. So those are some things that I would like to say and also recommend.
Well, I am so on board with everything you just said and your whole mission, and I love it all. And I think you're a really powerful voice. You're in a very unique position with all of your intersectionality to talk at all these different angles. And we can learn so much from people like you that are willing to share. And I'm very grateful for you to share this with our audience. And people listening, please share this episode with anyone you know that might be a gay family thinking about adopting, or somebody that has a gay or trans kid, or somebody that is in an interracial adoption, or any of these intersections. Please share this and help spread the word about this information and resources that are available so we can help our adoptees have a better life and to get the validation that they are exactly right the way they are. Perfect or not, all the gray areas, and that everybody is just accepted for who they are, whatever that is. So thank you. Thank you, Tony, for being here. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Beth, for having me.
Yes. And make sure and go find Tony through Case, and remember all the links are in the notes. Find Unraveling Adoption on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And I do run an adoptive parents support group. It's free, and it's called Aptitude, a support group for adoptive parents facing adoptions challenges. We do lots of resources and share information and have speakers come, and Tony's going to be a speaker pretty soon. And so come on and join us if you're an adoptive parent or foster parent. The information is below as well. And if you're interested in supporting our mission and keeping our podcast episodes commercial free, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/unravelingadoption. More information about that is also below. I think that's all of the announcements, and I really appreciate you all listening to this very important topic. Please help us spread the word. And Tony and I want you all to stay safe.